Loneliness is killing people. Not slowly, not metaphorically. The biological evidence now shows that chronic loneliness triggers the same stress response as being physically attacked. Your nervous system cannot tell the difference between being alone in a room and being hunted. And a systematic review published in 2025 analyzed the biological mechanisms behind this, examining how loneliness rewires your autonomic nervous system, elevates your inflammatory markers, and increases your risk of dying from cardiovascular disease. The findings are not what most people expect, because this is not about feeling sad. This is about your heart, your arteries, your immune system, your brain, all of them, physically changed by loneliness. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what loneliness does to your nervous system, your cardiovascular system, and your brain, and why the US Surgeon General declared loneliness a public health epidemic in 2023. Before we go further, because this is Curious and Verified, here are the sources. The first is a systematic review published in Curious in March 2025, examining the biological impact of loneliness and social isolation on cardiovascular disease outcomes. The second is a systematic review and meta-analysis published in Scientific Reports, a Nature journal, in June 2024, covering 6 studies with 104,511 patients. Both links are in the description. Now, let's get into it. First, why does loneliness activate your stress response? Your nervous system has 2 modes. The sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, activated when you perceive threat. Heart rate up, blood pressure up, cortisol up. The parasympathetic nervous system, rest and recover, activated when you feel safe. Heart rate down, digestion working, inflammation resolving. These 2 systems are meant to balance each other. The 2025 review found that in chronically lonely individuals, this balance is disrupted. Lonely individuals showed consistently higher sympathetic nervous system activation and lower parasympathetic nervous system engagement compared to non-lonely individuals. In practical terms, their bodies were running in threat mode. Not occasionally, chronically, as a persistent background state. Here is what that chronic threat activation does to the cardiovascular system. The 2024 meta-analysis, covering 104,511 patients across 6 studies with follow-up periods of 4 to 13 years, found that loneliness and social isolation were associated with significantly higher rates of cardiovascular events. The mechanisms the review identified were specific. Lonely individuals showed higher total peripheral resistance, meaning their blood vessels were more constricted, higher resting systolic blood pressure, lower cardiac output, and lower heart rate variability, a measure of how flexibly the heart responds to changing demands. Low heart rate variability is one of the strongest known predictors of cardiovascular mortality. These are not minor differences. These are measurable, consistent biological signatures of a cardiovascular system under sustained stress. But loneliness does not stop at the heart. The 2025 review identified a second biological pathway, neuroinflammation. Chronic loneliness activates the immune system in a pattern that looks remarkably similar to what the body does when it detects infection. Pro-inflammatory cytokines, the same immune messengers we covered in our episode on anxiety and inflammation, are chronically elevated in lonely individuals. IL-6, TNF-alpha, C-reactive protein. These inflammatory markers increase the risk not only of cardiovascular disease, but of neurodegeneration. Research cited in the review found that loneliness increases the risk of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease. The same inflammatory cascade that raises your cardiovascular risk is also reaching your brain. Now here is where the neuroscience becomes genuinely disturbing. Loneliness does not just respond to social isolation. It anticipates it. The 2024 EEG study published in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience found that lonely individuals showed measurably different brain rhythms, specifically decreased beta band power, associated with altered attention, reward processing, and emotional regulation. The brain of a lonely person is not simply sad. It is in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning the social environment for threat, interpreting ambiguous signals as rejection, and becoming increasingly sensitized to perceived exclusion. This is the self-perpetuating loop that researchers have consistently identified. Loneliness makes the brain more sensitive to social threat. That sensitivity makes social interactions feel more dangerous, which drives further withdrawal, which deepens the loneliness. The nervous system is not simply responding to being alone. It is creating conditions that make connection harder. There is one more finding from the 2025 review that deserves particular attention. The effects of loneliness on cardiovascular health were not uniform across groups. Hispanic adults in the US, a population that often experiences higher rates of socioeconomic disadvantage and systemic barriers, showed particularly elevated cardiovascular risk associated with loneliness. This matters because it reminds us that loneliness is not purely a psychological experience. It is shaped by social structure, economic conditions, and access to resources. The biology of loneliness does not exist in a vacuum. It is amplified by inequality. Now, a critical eye. Both reviews are clear about their limitations. Much of the research on loneliness and cardiovascular disease is observational, meaning causal direction is difficult to establish. Does loneliness cause cardiovascular disease? Or do people with cardiovascular disease become more isolated? Or does a third factor, depression, poverty, poor health behaviors, drive both? The research suggests the relationship is bidirectional, but the precise causal architecture is still being mapped. The EEG study involved 139 participants, a small sample. The brain rhythm findings are preliminary and require replication, and most of the existing literature focuses on older adults. Whether the same biological patterns hold in younger populations, particularly as social media reshapes what loneliness means, is an open question that research has not yet fully addressed. Let's bring this back to where we started. Your nervous system cannot tell the difference between being alone in a room and being hunted. That is not a metaphor. It is a biological reality documented across studies involving more than 100,000 people. Chronic loneliness disrupts the autonomic nervous system. It raises blood pressure, lowers heart rate variability, constricts blood vessels. It activates inflammatory pathways that damage the heart and the brain. And it rewires the brain into a state of hypervigilance that makes connection increasingly difficult. The US Surgeon General declared loneliness a public health epidemic in 2023. The biology explains why. The question worth sitting with is this: we have built entire healthcare systems around treating what loneliness does to the body. But how much are we investing in treating loneliness itself? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Both studies are linked in the description, peer-reviewed and free to read. As always on this channel, the source comes first. Subscribe if you want more, and we will see you in the next one.